You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. For over 40 years, B&H has been the professional source for photography, video, audio, and more. For your favorite gear, news, and reviews, visit us at bnh.com or download the B&H app to your iPhone or Android device. Now here's your host, Alan Weitz.
Greetings and welcome to the B&H Photography Podcast. On today's episode, we're going to be using Audio-Technica microphones, and we're delighted to be supported by Audio-Technica and encourage our listeners to check out their mics, headphones, and other gear on the B&H Photo website. Today's show is going to be fun as John and I welcome author and, I quote, scholar of visual culture. I love it. Kim Beil to the program. We could speak with Kim about 1,000 photo-related topics as she's written about as much as anybody can on the subject. And we're going to discuss her new book, Good Pictures, A History of Popular Photography, later in the show. But we asked Kim to join us today to talk primarily about her extensive collection of camera manuals, photography instruction books, and photo magazines that date back to the origins of the medium and are featured regularly on her Instagram feed at kim.beil. Welcome to the show, Kim.
Thanks for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Let's just fill out more details about you here. Just get you embarrassed, you know. Dr. Kim Beil is a professor at Stanford University specializing in the history of photography. She's written on subjects as diverse as the relationship between color photography and modern architecture and on the use of blur in automotive advertising. Her work has been published in Art Forum, Art in America, and Extra, Contemporary Art Quarterly, as well as scholarly publications such as After Image, Museums and Social Issues, and Visual Resources. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. Let me ask you, is there anything about photography that you don't like at all? That you absolutely hate?
That's a great question. You know, I love everything about the medium of photography. I love looking at pictures and making them, holding the objects in my hands and the equipment. I think the only thing I don't like about photography has nothing to do with the medium itself, but only to do with how it's policed. I don't like sometimes the gendered or racialized assumptions about who can be a photographer or what and who appropriate subjects are. I think sometimes when we describe photography as a singular medium, there's a tendency to refer to an average type of user. But those norms often privilege the people who are in control of publishing or manufacturing, and they don't always represent the truly diverse people who are photographers and who are the subjects of photography. So I love the medium itself, and I want it to be accessible to everyone.
It's funny that you mention that because about a month ago, I got a Taschen book on advertising and marketing in the 50s. I forget the exact title of it, but it's several hundred pages, and it was chock full of advertising on all sorts of topics, from automobiles to home appliances to everything. And it was amazing that it was all white males with the proper wife, and anybody other than a white person with fair complexion was in a position of servitude in some measure. And it was fascinating. And that's if you saw them at all. And I just found it to be amazing. It was an eye-opener to me. I grew up then, and it was part of my norm. I never realized it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I didn't realize it in looking at the pictures either. I mean, certainly when I look at some of the Kodak How to Make Good Pictures manuals, I see pictures that look like my own childhood photos, and I'm a white woman from the suburbs. But the places where they did stand out to me was when I started learning photography and I was reading these manuals for instruction, and I always ran up against the pronoun he. And that made me feel as a young girl like maybe this isn't for me. And of course, it's a convention of the time to use that singular pronoun. But I think, the images and the language really stand out to us today.
And it's interesting, too, that many of the how-to books and the manuals are all about making photography accessible to everybody or easy for everybody or affordable for everybody. Yet, as you're pointing out, there's a whole, segment of society that may not be included in that everybody.
Yeah, and it's not to say that those people weren't taking pictures. Certainly women and people of color were taking pictures. As far back as the earliest practitioners in the United States. And one of the very first portrait photographers in the U.S. was a free Black man in New Orleans named Jules Lyon.
Right.
So there's been a history of involvement with the medium, but people of color and women weren't represented in the advertisements or in some of the instructional books, at least until the second half of the 20th century.
Kind of curious, in your research and in your work, have you found books or I guess, yeah, photo books, how-to books that are aimed at an audience of color, or even in Spanish language, or anything that kind of doesn't fit the normal mold?
Yeah, these are great questions, and certainly an area that I'm hoping to research more. I think my access to many of these books has been through libraries in the US, and increasingly on eBay, as I'm sure we're going to talk about. But I haven't had access to many books made in other parts of the world. Um, I think certainly the Fujifilm how to books would be an interesting counterpoint. The first manual that I know of that was written by a Black photographer was by Gordon Parks, and that was only published in 1947. And it wasn't directed specifically to photographers of color. His book, and as I'm sure he wanted it to be, was accessible to photographers who were interested in flash photography, which is the title. Um, but there were some women publishing how to articles, especially in the 19th century, and occasional books. There's an issue of the photo miniature that was written by an amateur named Catherine Stanberry. So there are some limit cases, but I would love to find more. There was a period before photography was truly established. So, the Daguerrean era, so 1840s to 1860-ish, when it wasn't quite understood yet as men's only medium. And during that period, there were women studio owners. People went to women for their portrait photographs. And it wasn't considered completely out of the norm. It is still a small percentage overall, but there were women entrepreneurs working in the medium in the beginning. And then it seems like there's more of a drop off as there's a move towards professionalization. And then you have that bifurcation of the practice with the rise of the amateurs in 1888, 1890. And that's when you start to see the women pushed off into one side. And then again in the 1950s, you've got the backlash following women's access into the workplace during World War II, and the 1950s, goes back to really traditional gender norms. So there are kind of waves during the history where women are closely involved in the medium and all aspects of its production, but represented, in different ways in the how-to manuals.
I gotta just make a comment about this that I've probably mentioned it a few times, but I worked commercially for about 25 years, doing a lot of editorial work and corporate work, and I'm going to say that 75 to 80% of my assignments were given to me by women,
Mm,
photo editors, graphic designers, people who were giving the work out, who were assigning these projects, and not just for editorial, for corporate, for annual reports, advertising, were women
hmm
who were choosing men to shoot these. And this is my experience of it, going back from the mid 70s to late 90s.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, they were choosing you. Maybe they weren't just choosing all men. But
I
I
still
would.
had a full head of hair, and I was kind of cute back then. But no, but seriously, I mean, these are the same people who were choosing, all of the photographers that are out there, not just me.
hmm
And these were from major corporations, magazines, publishers. And again, it always kind of struck me that, yeah, there were not very many women photographers that were illustrators, for that matter. And look who's giving out the work.
Mm.
And I
Yeah,
have no
I
answer
think,
for that.
well, there are some interesting changes recently too with the establishment of groups like Women Photograph and Diversify Photo.
Sure.
These are basically agencies that are promoting the work of photographers of color and women photographers to make simply finding those photographers easier. Sometimes it is just a matter of almost accidental canonization, and
Hmm.
just making it more obvious that there are choices out there that don't have to be the same people who are always called on again and again.
Hmm.
That's a good point. Can I ask a little bit about the photo manual collection that you have? I mean, is it something that you have been acquiring for years and years, or is it just items that you've picked up in relationship to the work that you're doing in the book that you published?
Well, it was really because I was stumped in some of my research. Manuals are not typically collected by libraries because when the new volume comes out, the old volume is deaccessioned because it's considered out of date. So you could never find a full run of the Kodak How to Make Good Pictures because each one is trashed at the end of its run. So a friend of mine put me in touch with the Leonian Foundation, and they offered me Philip Leonian's library of how-to books.
Oh,
Um, so that was the initial chunk of my collection that I used during research on my book. I also did some research at the Prelinger Library in San Francisco, which intentionally collects instructional material, not just for photography, but for film and the uses of film in more industrial applications. So that was definitely the beginning of my kind of accidental collection.
Ha-
But yeah,
ha-
recently it has grown a lot and probably will continue to.
how were these Kodak books distributed? Was it by a subscription, or were they available in bookstores or camera shops? How were they distributed?
I don't know exactly, except that I do have a few with camera shop stickers on them. So my guess is that
Ah,
you
okay.
could purchase them there. There's a whole variety of books. The ones that I rely on most, the How to Make Good Pictures, are real books, hardcover and softcover, and about 5 by 8. But then there are a bunch of other types of manuals and magazines. They also had their magazine called Kodakery. They had
Yeah.
smaller kind of magazine format things that would go out with cameras. So there are lots of different ways that they were reaching their consumers.
Time Life magazine also came out with a wonderful series of photography books, hardbound books on different topics that were available in supermarkets. And they're gorgeous books. I think I still might have 2 or 3 of them laying around. But it was a good series of maybe about 15, 16 books, possibly 20. I don't remember. But each one had a different theme. And I remember it was a hardbound, I believe, square format. It was just a beautiful, beautiful book. And they came out periodically over a period of a year, I think.
Wow, that's fascinating that they were in supermarkets.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And so, would you consider yourself a collector now? I mean, are you out, looking for new material, and like what strikes your fancy when you come across an old, or maybe not even that old manual?
Yeah, I think I do have to admit that I am collecting now. Uh, I'm looking on eBay and sometimes through auction houses. I mostly, because of the format that I'm sharing these in on Instagram, one of the things that's most important to me is the cover. So I love having a great cover image and illustrations throughout the book. I think the ones that appeal to me most are the ones that teach things like composition because it focuses on those issues that interest me in, who's in the picture, how does form influence the content of a picture, and how do those things change over time?
And are there any authors, or I mean, I know that many famous and well-known photographers have put out books, how-to books, manuals, or even philosophy-related books. But are there authors who are not necessarily known as photographers who have just put out so many books that they've become kind of well-known in that, right?
Yes, there
Mm.
are a few, mostly more in the genre of editors, I think.
Mm.
Jacob Deschamps, who was the longtime photo columnist for the New York Times, released at least half a dozen books, and they are always directed at amateurs. I tend to prefer those ones that are speaking to amateurs. The voice and the personality of the author is most visible in those. Um, so I mentioned Catherine Stanbury earlier. I love her book that she calls Leaves from an Amateur's Notebook. One of my
Oh,
other favorites is Charles Taylor's book from 1902 called Why My Photographs Are Bad. So these are all
That's
kind
the
of,
book I want to read. I love
yeah,
that.
totally.
oh, it's wonderful. I just love these books because they speak from really from one amateur to another. And so they do tell you about their history in the medium, and they promise to give you all the clues to making yourself a better photographer. They don't speak from a position of professional authority.
Right, right. Which is often the pain, and which is often why these books kind of turn people off, I find, anyway.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I have a book that I picked up at a flea market a zillion years ago. It's the Photographic Instruction Book by Townsend T. Stith from 1903. And it's got a red cover, and it is absolutely wonderful to read. He talks about, the proper etiquette for taking pictures, and all the formulas are in there. And he even tells you the best way of taking a picture while riding a bicycle. And I don't remember the last time
Oh, I
somebody
need to
gave
see
me that
that.
kind of advice. And he wasn't wearing a helmet either, I might add. But it's wonderful because there's an innocence to it, and there's none of the I don't know what the artsiness that we put around photography now, and none of all of these auras of mystique. It was just about taking pictures,
Did he talk
of
about
friends and
bokeh?
family. I'm sorry.
Did he talk about bokeh or bouquet?
No, not at all. Not at all. No.
So what about the I guess what are more instruction booklets? I mean, there are several on your Instagram feed that are dedicated or are instruction booklets for a particular camera. I find those pretty interesting as well. Are you out looking for those, or are they just coming your way? I mean, I imagine those are somehow easier to find, maybe because they're more affordable and tossed away more so. I don't know, but how do you think about
Um,
that?
yeah, it's interesting. They seem to be about the same price on eBay.
Mm, okay,
For me, they're wonderful because they distill all that advice into just 8 to 12 pages. And
right.
so you get a lot of that prescriptive advice, like always shoot with the sun behind you, or never get the keystoning effect in photographs of tall buildings. So that kind of prescriptive advice is something that I respond to, and having it distilled in these short booklets is great. They're also a lot easier to store. You don't need to have shelves and shelves of them.
I'm looking now again at the Instagram and that Gordon Parks book that you mentioned with the real basic simple cover. I love it. It's just right after the war, and he put that book out. That's wonderful. Huh.
Yeah, I think he was already active in as a member of Life, and
Right.
certainly this is post FSA photography. And Flash was a hot topic then, because it was just becoming available on the consumer market. So things had been um, improved during the war, and companies were finally able to market these Flash kits to basically amateurs, or maybe what we would call prosumers today.
And how much of these different trends that you've seen are tied to the technology and to the camera companies coming out with new features, new devices? Do you see kind of like I don't know how to say it. What's the word I'm looking for? Maybe like cycles, and then like a surge of new books coming out on a topic and such like that.
Hmm. Yeah, it's fascinating actually. It's very tied to technology, but not necessarily in the way you would think. So you'll have a new technology like Flash come out, which means you can still very rapid motion easily. And then, of course, there are books that teach you how to do it. And then right after that, you've got a bunch of photographers who say, "Well, we don't want to do that. Why would
Right.
we want it to make? Why would we want to make these fast-moving things look like they're immobile?" And so there's a revaluation of the types of trends that came before, which weren't even trends, they were just mistakes. So you have technological advance and then an aesthetic kind of step backwards. And so that's,
Like a counter movement. Yeah.
in the 40s and 50s, you have people starting to reintegrate motion blur, which I see as a direct backlash to flash photography.
Is it fair to say that the manuals themselves and the how-to books kind of parallel all the thoughts there are on photography, whether it happens to be, the aesthetic of freezing motion compared to the blurred motion? I mean, is it all out there?
That's a really good question. I turned to the manuals originally rather than photographs themselves because the manuals name the trends,
Hmm.
and they otherwise, people even on Instagram don't necessarily say what kind of picture they're taking. They just tell you what they're taking a picture of. We privilege content over a description of form. And so I was using the manuals because I could really easily date these trends. But, that's not to say that the manuals were the only things teaching people. I mean, just like today, people have always learned from looking at other pictures. Um, so I'm sure that there are things that were happening in photography that weren't consciously taught by the manuals. And there were definitely things happening in photography that the manuals tried to unteach.
Right.
So that's where all those rules about the things you're not supposed to do, that's where all that comes in.
Hmm. I wonder, there must be books out there that you've come across where it is just about all the things you shouldn't do, right? I mean, that take I can imagine.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, every book has a few pages of mis- common mistakes, or Kodak has a section called "What Went Wrong," and I think these are, there are later kind of technological issues, like you've got a wrong flash sync speed, or you fogged your film. And earlier, a lot of the "what went wrong" things are like you weren't using the viewfinder, or you had your thumb over the lens. And so it's really neat to see them, these accidents, in the books as evidence of, well, diagnosing what might be the problem with your pictures.
I like the what you sent us in an email earlier from a 1957 book, Better Pictures, with the quote, "Who is that man with no head? That's Uncle Harry, because you never learned to point your camera." That's great. So, what about famous or very well known, established photographers who also wrote books? I mean, are there I guess it's fair to say that a lot of people who can do can't teach, and vice versa. Are there examples of photographers who've put out books that are also wonderful instruction manuals, and maybe the opposite, who are just not very good at
Yeah.
instruction? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, Ansel Adams is probably the best example of both the best known photographer, but also the best known photo teacher, because of the series of books on the zone system. And, maybe those things go hand in hand. Maybe he was so well known among people who are not solely involved in fine art photography because he was such an effective teacher. But there are other great photographers who put out great books. I think of Andreas Feininger, is a very prolific author, and from the 40s and the 70s to the 70s. He was the son of Lionel Feininger from the Bauhaus School. So Andreas worked in Life magazine and others, and he included a lot of his own photographs. I
I
love.
actually have a copy of his book right here in my hand, The Complete Photographer. It's a
Oh,
wonderful book. Yeah,
yeah, he
yeah,
wrote so many books. They are
yeah.
they are great. Arthur Rothstein, speaking of FSA genre photographers, also wrote a wonderful book called Creative Color in Photography,
Arthur
1962.
Rothstein hired me at my first job at Look magazine, where I was washing and drying prints in 1970.
He comes across as a really generous,
He was a
kind person. Was
lovely
that true?
man. He was a
Hmm.
lovely man, a real gentleman, a very, very sweet man. Yes.
So I would contrast that with Bernice Abbott's A Guide to Better Photography, where she doesn't come across as a teacher who would have been particularly generous. But people's writing style is different.
How about like the growth of YouTube tutorials and online, content and material that's out there? Is this, affecting the whole genre of how-to books? Are they still being made as regularly as they used to be?
I don't think they're being made as regularly as they used to be. Um, but there's still a demand for teaching. And some of that, like you said, comes across on YouTube tutorials. I'm kind of fascinated by TikTok, which teaches people how to make TikToks within TikTok itself. So there are lots of self reflexive tutorials. But there are also books that have grown out of these, popular trends. And I think of, Henry Carroll's "So You Want to Be Instagram Famous," this whole series produced by Lawrence King. So there are definitely books that are looking at the social media today and publishing in book format, training you how to succeed online.
Hmm.
Yeah, there are a few recent series. that are a video series or interactive online series, and books that go with them. I think Joel Merowitz's recent book on street photography is absolutely astounding. He really teaches you how to think about working on the street and doesn't give you just a list of 10 rules about composition, but I think the book is intended to help photographers discover what motivates and inspires them and helps them find their own voice.
And is he using his own images as examples, or is he talking about the work of a range of people?
No, he uses his own images, and I think it's really valuable because you can see how the images come together. And he describes how the moment coalesced and what he was looking for and why it worked at this moment, but hadn't a minute earlier.
Let's take a short break, traffic and weather, and come back with more with Kim Beil and History of Popular Photography. Stay tuned. This episode of the B&H Photography Podcast is produced using Audio Technica microphones. Check the link in our show notes for the Audio Technica product page on the B&H website. Okay, we are back. Let's talk about your book, Good Pictures, A History of Popular Photography. And in this, you talk about events that kind of changed the direction of photography, if that's a good way of putting it. Can you give us a couple of good examples of things that happened over the course of time that changed how people are looking at photography? And maybe a good place to start would be Kodak itself, because, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Kodak might be the first company involved in photography that understood how to brand itself to the public. And even the name Kodak was made up because it's a catchy, memorable phrase or two syllables.
Yeah, that's right. So this book deals not only with fine art photography or any one part of photography as it's been practiced since 1839, but it focuses on pictures that would have been widely seen. So it encompasses art, but it also encompasses advertising and fashion and portraiture and snapshots. So right off the bat, you've got styles that are emerging in the 19th century for portraits, which was one of the early, most viable aspects of the medium. And so you see people representing themselves initially in a way that looks a lot like a mugshot today. But eventually, aesthetic trends evolve, and people, take on three-quarter length portraits or three-quarter views. So there are lots of ways that photographs change in style. So before Kodak, the invention of the Kodak in 1888, when photography became really accessible to amateurs, it wasn't limited to professionals because suddenly you have a photo finishing industry that enables people to send their film back for processing. Um, you still had popular subjects that were seen widely by people throughout the country and across different social demographics. But certainly the Kodak is one of those main changes in the history that enables people to take pictures and to copy popular styles in a way that they couldn't have done easily before.
And how much of these aesthetic changes or these aesthetic trends, it's kind of what I mentioned earlier, I suppose, but are brought on by, technical changes. And you mentioned a style of portraiture where someone is just staring at the camera. I mean, that has to have something to do with the fact that the exposure time was so long, right? And there wasn't really a lot of opportunity to get nuanced facial expressions or gestures, correct?
Yeah, that's a great point. So in these early portraits, the first say 10 to 20 years, you have people staring, fully frontal, facing the camera. And that was really an aesthetic demand. So people thought that they were paying for a picture of their face and they wanted to see their whole face in it. And they thought that shadows detracted from that, believe it or not. And so when the photographer, New York based William Kurtz, came along and pioneered his Rembrandt effect lighting technique, he started adding a side light to give some dimensionality to the face. And then pretty quickly, that style was picked up within a year or two, and there were already detractors from it. So it wasn't yet a more natural representation. People still had to be held in portrait posing apparatuses. Um, so the technology had improved a little bit since 1839 to when Kurtz introduced this style in the 1860s, but it wasn't, like a snapshot today. It really truly was an aesthetic change that was kind of representing people in a more artistic way, maybe not necessarily a more natural way.
Right, right. He put his own touch on it. He
Hmm.
brought his artistic touch to it. Interesting. Yeah. Uh,
I think it's
and
important to keep in mind also that all pictures taken back then were all time exposures. I mean, long,
Hmm.
because there was, ISO speeds, what, 3 or 6 for a lot of these emulsions that were being mixed up. There was no such thing as 100 or 400 or 1,000 ISO. It was all very slow. The cameras were slow. So nobody was moving anywhere. So I get style wise, people kind of restricted.
Hmm. Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, in the course of the research for this book, I learned that there was a season for photographing. That if you lived in a northern city like New York or Boston, you couldn't take portraits in the winter because there wasn't enough light. So even though most portrait studios were on the top floor of buildings, if they were in a city to get the most light from skylights, you basically couldn't work in the winter at all.
hmm,
Yeah,
I knew.
that's true. Yeah, that's right.
I
Because
like
everyone
that.
went for north light, and the light goes away from the north in the winter months. That's correct. Yeah, I didn't even think about that.
Wow. And any other particular trends that come to mind that, I mean, that are in the book, of course, that you'd like to speak about? I'm sure, I know there's 50 in the book, and it's a wonderful book, but is there anything that you just want to mention that interests you particularly?
Yeah, there are a few. I mean, earlier we were talking about the joke in the beginning of the Keeley Better Pictures book, and he says, who is that guy without a head? In the 1960s, it suddenly became popular to have a kind of close cropped portrait. So for at least 50 years before that, the advice in all of the amateur manuals was make sure you're looking through your viewfinder, give plenty of space to your portrait subject so that you don't get any part of their head cropped out of the frame. And then, in the 60s, you start having photographers move in closer and they start to crop at the hairline or crop in on the face a little bit. And doing that in camera, not necessarily later in the darkroom. And so that was a real stylistic change, definitely taking something that was originally considered an accident and making it into a deliberate effect.
Well,
Um,
there's a difference between decapitation and cropping, also.
yes, but so a partially cropped through head was probably um, as much a failure as a total decapitation.
I actually love photos that where the heads are partially cropped, or parts of the face, or you're seeing a half a face. I always found those pretty fascinating,
Yeah, they are fun. They are.
it takes me away from looking at quote unquote the person, and looking at the aspects of the face, and kind of digging in a little bit deeper. So that's one of the reasons I suppose I like it. But and I'm wondering, is there any examples of, let's say, an art photo or an art style, or even something that was considered avant-garde that crept into popular photography, and then we see it, it becomes something that's very the norm, that at one point was just considered, just, if not radical, just the unique look of one individual photographer?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say we were just talking about cropping, and this was also news to me that cropping really didn't exist before the 20th century. I mean, most things were contact printed, and either your negative was of such a large scale that it was easy to put it down on a piece of developing paper and print it, or it was so small that you couldn't blow it up. And before electric light enlargers, you had to do this all with a solar enlarger, which is a good use of your winter months if you can't be shooting portraits. But cropping really didn't become a possibility until the 20th century. And I think maybe if I'm looking right first at say somebody like Stieglitz and making these tall, narrow pictorialist views of New York, that wouldn't have been widely practiced beforehand unless people were cutting their pictures out themselves.
Or if anything, just putting a mat over it, which is what the common thing. You had a tintype or something else. You just
Mm.
put a paper mat, or quite often that came when you bought the picture, was put into a little sleeve of sorts, cardboard or paper, and that basically framed it in a sense, and
Mhm.
that was it. But yeah, otherwise you just had the edges of the picture,
Mhm.
which were often
Yeah,
pretty
and I
cool.
think in those cases they were probably cutting out the areas that were less in focus because of lens aberrations, or the size of the plate doesn't match the size of the lens image.
With irregular emulsions, it gets sloppy towards the edges, so you just
Mhm.
crop it out that way with paper. That's the
Mhm.
way I've seen them. But yeah, I never thought about that you don't see cropping in these old pictures at all. It's all contact prints. It's true.
Are there any kind of moments in our collective history, let's say, well, obviously since the beginning of photography, but where there was like a rapid change in the styles of popular photography, and does that reflect social changes? I mean, I know we think a lot about the 60s and 70s and the social changes that they brought, artistic changes as well. I mean, is that then reflected in popular photography, or as you mentioned earlier, post World War II, and the change in the workforce and items like this? Do they find themselves, dripping down into
Mhm.
popular photography?
Yeah, dripping down and sometimes bubbling up, I think. Maybe the first one is an example of bubbling up, and that's
Right.
the invention of the Kodak, when suddenly you have so many more photographers working and making pictures that they're maybe not exposed properly or framed in the way that the photographer wished, but suddenly there's just a giant quantity of pictures and different places you can go with the camera. With a portable handheld camera, you can do things that you couldn't have done before. So you have street photography, you have like travel and family portraiture that happens right outside the house. So that's an example of amateur practice being seen on a wide scale. And then I
Correct.
think you're right to point at the 60s and 70s too, that in this period, there's a lot of looking back to former mistakes. So that because there's a moment of intense technological advance, you have really fine grained film, you have which you can blow up and crop down again later. You also have really high speed films that you can use in low light situations. And then you end up with photographers using both of those things kind of against themselves to make really grainy prints or introducing blur intentionally. So, yeah, I think both of those are related to major social change at the time, too.
I think Polaroid also has to be included in that as being a major game changer, where all of a sudden you could share pictures in real time or 60 seconds after the fact, which is about as instantaneous as you can get back in those days. But that added a whole different dimension to photography too, because you take pictures and then say, "Oh, well, let me do that too," and it was going around, and people saw it in real time, and everybody went home with their pictures and actual prints that were unique in many ways. So I don't think that could be overlooked. Um, Again, I thought that was a pretty impressive piece of technology for its time. And it's still, to me, amazing that you could take a picture and just pull a print out like that. To me, it's more
Mm-hmm.
amazing than digital in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
Well, speaking of digital, maybe we can jump, to our current state, and talk about any trends that have. There's just probably so many, but I do have this question that I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to try to get it out as best as possible. But I've always found that there's this narrative out there that because of digital and because of smartphones and people taking so many pictures, that it's kind of diluted the art form, or it just makes it so easy anybody can do it, and therefore that's somehow bad. I actually kind of find that to be the opposite, and I look back, as I mentioned in my notes, to the countless shoeboxes and drawers filled with just horrible snapshots that my parents and grandparents took that were never going to get looked at again. So I really want to know if, like, what you're seeing out there today with this proliferation of imaging, uh, has the dynamics really changed much, or is it just the fact that there is more of what we had? I mean, I don't see photography getting any worse, is what I'm trying to get at.
I totally agree with you. I don't see photography getting worse either. I see it getting better. And I think this goes back to my belief. My only gripe with the medium has nothing to do with the medium itself, but really only with how it's policed.
Mm.
And I think all of these pictures are speaking to particular audiences and they serve a purpose, but they don't all claim to be, nor do they all need to be considered fine art photographs. And certainly within the category of fine art, you're looking for uniqueness of vision. You're not looking for something that's, repeating a popular trope. But for a family photograph, I mean, that's really not your intention. And I think the
Mhm.
pictures we might look at as bad or boring today served a purpose not only to record that event, but also to simply mark the event in the moment. I still take a lot of pictures that I don't share, but because somehow taking the picture points to the importance of the moment for me, it's a way of underscoring how much I appreciate being in a particular place. And so whether or not I look at the picture later, whether I judge it a good picture or not, I think is almost immaterial. Like photography is a practice as much as it is a product.
Let me throw this thought to follow up on that. Okay, you have John. You mentioned we all have these pictures of taken of of Aunt Sally sitting in the boxes that they're not good pictures and blah blah. But you know something, we're all very familiar with those pictures. And I'm in the midst of a move right now, and obviously you go through boxes and you start throwing things out. And there are photographs that I found that I remember from my childhood being in
Mhm.
scrapbooks, family scrapbooks, and they're not great pictures, but I remember them.
Of course.
And the opposite is going on today. Kim, you're right. There's some phenomenal photography going on these days. I look at what's out there, and people are doing amazing things with cameras and imagery, with basic cameras and as well as the highest technology cameras there are. And then I also have to think about a quote from Ralph Gibson. I was watching an interview with him shortly before we did our episode with him, and he had an interesting point of view. He doesn't bother with Instagram or anything. He goes, because the fact is, no matter how good the picture is, people look at it they average about 2.5 to 3 seconds, and then they flip on to the next picture. But we all remember those faded black and white pictures of Aunt Sally and ourselves walking around, those horrible outfits we wore all back those days when we were kids.
Mhm.
We remember them. Yet,
Hmm.
how
I
many of
do.
these fantastic pictures are we going to remember that we flipped through on our phones?
Well, I
Yeah.
was just going to say that I find myself actually on occasion doing just that, like just literally flipping through my iPhone and
Yeah.
letting it almost randomly stop at a photo from a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Some of them I've forgotten, but they just always normally bring back great memories, and I almost look at it the exact same way as when I used to look through a photo album. I don't feel any difference, and maybe I don't take as many photos as others, but the basic idea is the same. I do realize that, for example, I use my phone now as like a notebook. I'll take a
Sure.
picture of just some text just so I remember something,
Hmm.
and I do things like that I never would have done before. But this idea of memory and is basically the exact same.
Yeah, I think maybe it's sometimes the familiarity that breeds appreciation. And so when we see those pictures of Aunt Sally over and over again, they start to become part of your memory.
Mm.
And, unless you're spending time like John going back through the photo album on your phone, you don't spend the same amount of time with those pictures. And so they don't have the same kind of trigger for memory.
Mm.
But I use my
Mhm.
phone as a notepad as well. And I would tend to describe those things as pictures and maybe as important as any kind of stereotypical beautiful view that I might feel compelled to snap.
Right, right. I mean, on the flip side, I do look at my kids and like the sheer quantity of photos they'll take just to get the one image, and then when they don't delete the 40 other photos that they took, it drives me crazy. But at the same time, it is a different attitude, I think, and I'm not exactly sure about that. But when I see just the amount of photos that they will take to get that selfie look that they want or whatever it happens to be, that does make me think. But however, let me ask him real quickly about photo magazines, because you also collect photo magazines, it seems, and we had on our show more than a year ago now Vinceletti, who put out a great book on
Yeah.
fashion magazines
Mm-hmm.
and the value of them and collecting them, and how in some cases they are the truest and original form of some great photographs, Avedon and others. Um, how do you look at photo magazines, and how is your collection coming?
My collection of photo magazines was entirely accidental, and there are only two or three things in it, and they were sent to me by a generous eBay connection who said, "Oh, I also have these. I'll just throw them in the box." So I don't have a large collection, certainly nothing that approximates Vince's. But I think, his book is brilliant and that work is really important because, photographers have done lots of work over the past uh, 70 years. They aren't ever just working in one area of photography or another. And so I love that the fashion work shows them working with art directors and editors and shows them in this ecosystem of images in a way that, when we only see one print in a museum, it doesn't tell the same story.
Right, right. And any examples of fashion photography that have kind of led to a trend in popular photography?
That's a good question. I think probably, obviously, Avedon's work, especially his use of borders and printing full frame was important in the 60s. Um, and then more recently, I think Jürgen Teller and the on camera flash is huge. We still see that. And almost like blending an Avedon blank white background with this hard flash and shadows is kind of bringing the 1960s into the 2010s. But we see fashion photographs all the time, even on Instagram when we're not going through magazines. So I think that is one of the major areas of photography that is popular but sometimes overlooked.
Hmm. And how about maybe the reverse effect where what popular photographs or the style of popular photographs, snapshots have then kind of uh, come back as an artistic form. I'm trying to think of Nan Golden's work, for example, maybe where you have almost snapshots of her friends and people she was hanging out with.
Yeah, Nan Goldin's a perfect example. There's something about the snapshot aesthetic that promises authenticity, and I think Teller is using that also because the on-camera flash was never associated with professional photographic work, and so when we see those like hard shadows looming behind subjects, it looks like it was just a simple party snapshot when in fact it was, really set up clearly for the photograph. But I do see this in contemporary apps like the Fuji Cam, which includes a little digital time and date stamp in the digital
Hmm.
photo. You can actually
Right.
change the time and date.
Oh yeah.
So it's just, it's the same thing as using like a fake um, filed out negative carrier frame and adding that later in Photoshop. It promises authenticity because this style always promised authenticity, but it doesn't necessarily come from the same place.
So actually, I have maybe one last question, Kim, if that's okay. Do you have an all-time favorite how-to book?
So it's a funny question, right? Because I love these books that I can talk back to. So the
Mhm.
ones that get me riled up the most are sometimes the how to make good pictures because they have these
Right.
really prescriptive rules. But the one book stands out that's not in my collection, but I wish it were, and it's by Bunny Yeager, who was a pinup
Sure.
model in the mid-century, and she made a book called How I Photograph Myself, which is
Oh
pretty
wow.
interesting. She's turning the
Oh,
tables.
wow.
She becomes her own photographer. And she uses a lot of the same strategies of representing her as the male photographers who came before. But I think it does make a difference that she's in control of the camera.
Hmm. And maybe a follow-up question to that is, if you're kind of against the prescriptive model of what people should and should not do, uh, can you offer a definition of what you think is a good photo, or what strikes you as a good photo?
Yeah, I think it changes in different contexts.
Hmm.
And I think the best thing I could say overall is the photograph is good if it speaks to the people who it's meant to speak to. So it's a kind of communication that I'm going to make a different kind of picture to go in a museum than I would in a fashion magazine. And certainly the pictures that I take for myself when I'm out hiking are not the same things I'd post on Instagram. But anything that works within one of those contexts, if it's not that it's following those rules, but it's speaking in the dialect of that place. And I think that's the best way to define a good photograph for me, that it speaks to who it intends to speak to.
Okay, that is the wrap of another show. One last thing, Kim, talking in the library. What's that about?
So this is a series of YouTube conversations that I've had with photographers about photo books. And it started last year at the beginning of the pandemic when suddenly, my students were sent home from campus and none of us had access to the libraries, which is where, we are so lucky to have access to these incredible photo books, but, we didn't have them suddenly at home. And so I started these conversations where I ask a photographer to find one of their favorite photo books and we talk through it together. I think I'm one of those people who can't sit next to somebody reading without reading over their shoulder. So this is the equivalent of that for me. It's like reading a menu, but you really learn a lot more about the pictures when you see somebody else working through them, working through sequence and rhythm and framing. And it's been a real delight. I've had some wonderful guests, and I'm excited to continue.
That's great. And if people want to see more of your work, where can they go to?
You can find all these links on my website. It's Kim Beil, KIMBEIL.com. And that links to the YouTube series and to my Instagram and to the book.
Great. And also, let's not forget Kim's book, Good Pictures, A History of Popular Photography. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. And I love the cover, too. It's pure Kodak. I guess it's the coloring. Where can people get the book?
You can order the book on Amazon or through any of your local booksellers.
Okay, great. And again, all this will be in our show notes. Kim, thank you so much again for joining us today. It was a great conversation.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been really fun.
That's terrific. If you are not a subscriber to our show, head on over to Spotify or wherever you snag your favorite podcast and type in B&H Photography Podcast, hit enter, and you are no longer have to live in shame. And if you're already a subscriber, leave a nice comment. And you can also find us on the B&H Explorer website and on the B&H Photography Podcast Facebook group page. And one last thanks again to our friends at Audio-Technica for the use of their top shelf microphones. All that said, my name is Alan Weitz, and on behalf of John Harris and Jason Tables, thank you so much for tuning in today.